Chad Hasty Show, News Talk, 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. Thank you for tuning in. So yesterday, one of the big news story of the day, at least I think it was the big news story of the day, North Korea launching yet another missile. They're not really listening to what President Trump has to say, it does not seem. And joining us on the phones right now to talk about the latest missile launch, what it means for the U.S., and what it means really for the world, the Director of Defense Studies at the Center for the National Interest, Harry Kazianis, joining us once again here on the program. And Harry, we get you on every time it seems North Korea launches a missile.
Good to be with you, Chad.
Thanks for joining us. I appreciate it. Tell our audience a little bit about, as far as what you know about yesterday's missile launch and what this means. Is it any kind of game changer moving forward, at least for the North Korean regime?
Well, what the North Koreans have done has basically demonstrated that they have the capability, at least for their missiles, to range all of the United States. In fact, now their missiles can go probably into Mexico, so that's how far these missiles have really come in the last few years. The scope and scale of the North Korean missile program has really expanded over the last couple of years quite dramatically. You know, if you had told me, Chad, 2 years ago we'd be on this program talking about North Korean missiles having the potential capability to hit the U.S., I'd say you're crazy, to be honest with you. But the North Koreans, they show how far you can go if you're willing to basically starve, your own population of 25 million people to build nuclear weapons and build missiles. And, in the months and years to come, this is just going to get worse. The North Koreans want nuclear weapons to hit the U.S. in the event of a war or some sort of regime change operation by the U.S. So they're going to continue to do this. And remember, in February, the Olympics are in South Korea. So I guarantee you Kim Jongun is going to have a surprise for us then as well.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. One thing that I have read before about these missile launches is that, while they have, a lot of them have been successful, we don't know yet if they could actually load a warhead onto these missiles and still reach the U.S. Is that true?
You're great question. The thing is, we don't really know. Now, the North Koreans have the capability to miniaturize a nuclear device and put it on the top of a missile. But what we don't know for certain is when they fire that missile, the warhead detaches and it has to go through the atmosphere to hit a city or military base or whatever. Can it survive that atmospheric reentry? That's the trick for the North Koreans. Now, there was a report in August by a publication called The Diplomat that said that they do have a crude reentry capability if they fired a missile at the U.S. or in a normal trajectory. We don't know for certain, to be honest with you. And I think that's what the test yesterday was all about, to basically check that reentry technology to see if it's working. And I think that explains why the North Koreans have held off on ICBM launches since July. They need some time to sort of look at the data, see where they've done, things correctly, where they need to make improvements. And I think that explains the lull, to be honest with you.
China apparently, according to Reuters, expressed, quote, grave concern over the North Korean missile launch. We've heard that type of language before from China. Can they get any tougher on North Korea? And is China what's holding back really an international response to North Korea?
Well, I have to give the Chinese credit. Really, for the last 8 UN Security Council resolutions before this one in the summer, the Chinese would enforce the sanctions for a couple months, and then, people like me and you would stop talking about this and move on to the next big item, and the Chinese would just let the sanctions go. This time it's been much different, I have to say. The North Koreans are feeling the squeeze economically. There's issues with food security. Gas prices in Pyongyang have gone up dramatically. And now we have North Korean soldiers who are literally running across the DMZ trying to get to freedom. So there is signs that the sanctions are having an impact. But let's be honest here. The Chinese, it is in their interest to make sure the North Koreans don't collapse because they don't want to inherit millions of refugees or have to send troops into North Korea to try and stabilize that country. So they're going to push the North Koreans, but they're only going to go so far. And we have to remember that.
Well, and that's what brings me to my next question. When the president says yesterday, we're going to handle it, we're going to do something about it. And I know we've talked about this before with war game scenarios that you've played out, and and what can the United States and what can the Trump administration really do if we don't want to, have North Korea bomb Japan and China and South Korea and us? Can the U.S. really do anything other than sanctions?
Well, I think the good thing here is that the Trump administration really seems like they've picked a containment strategy. And I know a lot of people don't like that. A lot of my friends in conservative circles they can't stomach that. They don't want to see, the North Koreans have a capability to hit the United States with a nuclear weapon. But here's a news flash for you, Chad. The Russians can already hit us with nuclear weapons. The Chinese can hit us with nuclear weapons. A lot of other countries can do this. And we know the playbook for dealing with countries that we don't like that have nuclear weapons. I mean, Stalin built nuclear weapons. Mao Zedong, that murderous madman, built nuclear weapons. And we were able to successfully contain those countries. And we've never had any sort of nuclear wars or anything like that. Now, is that uncomfortable? Does that make the American people's stomach turn because North Korea has these weapons? Absolutely. And that's why we need to try and contain them as much as possible, take every dollar away from Kim Jongun as possible, so this way they can't build 100 ICBMs. We can cut it to maybe 10 or 15 or 20 and make those ICBMs and nuclear weapons as expensive as possible. That's the strategy here. It's the only viable one because, we've talked about it before. If you're going to start a war with North Korea, you're talking millions dead and you're talking trillions of dollars in reconstruction aid. And I don't think that's anything the American people want to go through.
Yeah, well, and you look at North Korea, and we go back decades under this idea that, okay, if we give North Korea enough money, if we give North Korea a little bit of latitude, maybe they won't build nuclear weapons. Obviously, that has not worked out. You look at Iran, it seems like to me, we're sort of going through the same thing here with Iran. We're trusting that Iran will live up to this deal when I don't know how much we can actually trust that nation. And when North Korea has a relationship with Iran, how much is that nuclear technology going over to the Iranians? I mean, it's something that, don't we have to look at Iran for the future and say, okay, we obviously could not trust the North Koreans. We can't trust the Iranians.
Chad, it's a really good question. I think about this a lot. And we do know that the Iranians and the North Koreans have a relationship. There's been reports that, Iranian scientists have been to North Korea studying their technology. In fact, we know a lot of Iranian missiles have come from North Korea. So none of that should be a shock. But I think there's a bigger question here that we all need to ask as Americans. What is our policy going to be when rogue states and rogue actors start developing nuclear weapons? Because I tell you, it's going to get very costly if we think we're going to use military options every single time. 20, 30 years down the line, I guarantee you there's going to be other countries that are going to want these weapons. Seems like the best playbook that we've been able to develop is containment and deterrence. And I know that isn't the best option. I know a lot of people, they look at the military options and they look at how big the U.S. military is and they think, okay, that's the way to go. But just like we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan and in Libya, sometimes the best of intentions and the best military options don't pan out the way you think they're going to go. Right. So I think a more restrained approach and thinking this through is really going to pay some dividends for us.
We've heard before in the past, and we're visiting with Harry Kazianis, Director of Defense Studies at the Center for National Interest. We've heard in the past that, and maybe it comes from both sides of the aisle from time to time about wanting to maybe reduce the United States nuclear program. I don't think the Trump administration is on board with that. Is there anything the U.S. can do to have more of a deterrent when it comes to the rest of the world? And like you said, in the next 20, 30 years, we may see other nations coming up with nuclear weapons. If the U.S. has more of a stockpile or a bigger stockpile or whatever it may be, is that a good deterrent for other nations?
I think it's important, Chad, that we keep it modernized. I mean, so much of the ICBMs we have were built in the 1960s. And there's great stuff you can find on YouTube and different programs where journalists go to these old silos that we have, and they're using floppy disks to run our nuclear triad with these ICBMs. I mean, it's a total joke. So we are working on modernizing this. We're going to build a new generation of submarines that are going to have, long-range ballistic missiles, because those subs were built in the 1970s and 1980s. So we're going to spend a lot of money modernizing our nuclear triad. And I think that's a good thing. And I think it shows to other countries, the potential, North Koreas or Irans of the future, that we mean business. And I think that's the best signal that we can show, that we're at the tip of the spear. And if, anybody were to challenge us in the nuclear front, we're ready for that.
Other than a nuclear attack from North Korea, what do you think would provoke the U.S. military or military action against North Korea?
There is a wrinkle in all this. The North Koreans signaled yesterday in a report to CNN that they could potentially be looking at doing an atmospheric nuclear test. And this is something they've sort of talked about in other press statements in other areas. That is something I am concerned about, that the U.S. military, potentially seeing that about to happen, might decide to launch a kinetic attack on, that North Korean warhead. That could create a whole crisis, especially if radioactive dust and debris got into the atmosphere from that. Or if they actually did detonate a nuclear weapon, maybe in the South Pacific, something far away from populated areas, that the Trump administration could respond. So the North Koreans need to understand they're at the very edges of what the United States is going to tolerate. And an atmospheric test might be a red line the North Koreans could cross. We'll have to see. They've been talking about it for a while, and something that bothers me is when the North Koreans talk about something for long enough, they tend to do it. So we really need to be very careful and watch this very, very carefully.
How is the U.S. defense system when it comes up to the North Koreans testing out a missile, and maybe the U.S. wants to test out their defense system and knock these things out of the sky? How is our defense system, and do you think we'll get to that point where the U.S. starts to test against a test from North Korea?
Our missile defenses we spent a lot of money on, going back to, Star Wars with Ronald Reagan and whatnot. Here's the problem. Trying to hit a bullet with another bullet, which is essentially what missile defense is, it's very hard to do. You could pour billions and billions of dollars into it, and it's very hard to get really good results. Because there's lots of ways that Russia and China, and I'm sure North Korea in the future, can put dummy missiles up to trick our missile defenses. It is not easy. The current strategy right now is that we would lob 3 missile interceptors at every North Korean missile. That is going to get very expensive very quickly. Imagine someday if North Korea had 100 ICBMs. At a minimum, we would want 300 interceptors to stop them. That would cost billions of dollars, because right now we're only on pace to have 40 interceptors within a few years. So that's the challenge in all this. It's a math game, but it's also an economics game as well, where this gets very expensive because missiles are a lot cheaper to make than missile defenses.
Harry, before I let you go, I know you already mentioned the Olympics coming up, and that you believe the North Koreans will probably at least test something out during that time period. Any other predictions for North Korea?
The other thing you want to watch, another date, is December 17th. That is the anniversary when Kim Jongun's father passed away. The North Koreans love to test things on different holidays and whatnot. So I would not be shocked if the North Koreans followed up with another ICBM test, or who knows, maybe perhaps they would do an atmospheric nuclear test. So we've got to watch this very carefully.
Harry Kazianis, as always, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good one. Very good information. Chad Hasty Show, KFYO.